سيدنا محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم لا علم إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت السميع العليم. اللهم لا علم إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت السميع العليم. اللهم لا علم إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت السميع العليم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. So last week we finished Hudaybiyah, and what was clear on the way back, despite the fact that all of the believers were so disappointed with what had happened, what became clear on the way back based on the revelation was, in fact, this was a great victory for the Muslims. And obviously one of the most difficult things that had happened at Hudaybiyah was the fact that Abu Jandal showed up in chains and shouted, are you going to let them take me back and punish me and torture me? And that was very difficult for the Muslims. And the Prophet ﷺ said, be patient and Allah will give you faraj. Another obvious humiliation outwardly for the Muslims was the idea of them having to return people from who flee from Mecca back to Mecca, and yet the opposite was not true. So one of the things that happens, and this is important, in that it began to become clear thereafter that the Prophet ﷺ was not only was given a great victory, but also that the mu'minun have to have patience with the wisdom of the Messenger of Allah. And what you get, I think, from Hudaybiyah is also the idea that there was a compromise. In other words, Hudaybiyah, and they wouldn't have been upset if there was not a compromise. There was a compromise. But the compromise did not compromise first principles. In other words, there was nothing that was disobedient to Allah in the compromises that the Messenger of Allah made. And this is an indication that Muslims in situations of weakness, that sometimes it does necessitate taking things that are difficult for the believers, with the idea that you think in terms of the long-term picture. You don't think in terms of the short-term picture. And one of them, some people say it's better to die a lion than live to be a sheep, right? And somebody responded to them, but sometimes it's better to be a sheep for one day so that you can live as a lion for 100 years. In other words, there's a wisdom sometimes in recognizing that you have to do things that might be difficult for a greater benefit. And this is clearly what the Messenger of Allah did. And so what happens is there was a man, a Thaqafi man, Abu Basir, who came from Taif, and he was in Mecca, and then he came into Islam. They imprisoned him. He goes to Medina on foot. And after that, the Meccans send two men to get him. And the Prophet ﷺ says that he has to go back with them. Again, this is difficult for them to see this. But now look at the change, and this is really important here, is that one of the changes is that the Ansar and the Muhajirun said to him, Abshir, Sayufarrajallahu anka. In other words, they weren't saying that to Abu Jandal. The same situation is happening, only now they're recognizing. So there's a change in the heart from Hudaybiyah to, because it's the same type situation, only their hearts now are really in submission to the wisdom of this. And this is the definitive event in terms of recognizing the wisdom of Hudaybiyah. There are many after this, but this one really begins to make it clear, because what happens is the two men take this man Abu Basir back, and he was a very powerful young man, and he overcomes them and kills one of them. The other flees. He goes back to Medina. The The Prophet ﷺ sees him, he's got his sword, he's just finished off one of these guys. The other man, Kawthar, comes back and tells the Prophet ﷺ what happened. The Prophet ﷺ, this is such an incredible wisdom, because what he says to him is, he says, you have to go back. Now obviously this man doesn't want to take him back, because they had two of them and he killed one of them. So what's going to happen if he goes back with just one of them? So the man says, I don't want him. Now the Prophet ﷺ is given a makhraj, a way out, without breaking the treaty. Because what happens, and what's important here, is the Messenger of Allah never once breaks the treaty of Hudaybiyah, whereas the Quraysh will eventually break it. And so it's really important that he maintain the treaty. And then he says an interesting thing about Abu Basir. He says, Sakirahu ummuhu, may his mother weep over him, which is a way of, it's really shafaqa, it's a type of compassion that somebody says. The Messenger said it to many people, and it was a traditional Arab saying that they used before Islam as well. And he says, what a good man he would be if only he had a'wan. He would be a good mujahid. Abu Basir heard that statement, and he understood that it was an indication for him to go do something. The Prophet gives him permission, and he goes out towards the west, towards the Red Sea, and there he meets up with Bedouin tribes, and he's also a da'iyah. And so people are becoming Muslim and joining up with him, and these people, traditionally, a lot of them were brigands. So what they start doing is they start يَقْطَعُونَ الطَّرِيقِ. The Quraysh are sending their caravans along that route, and they're starting to hit them. And then other Muslims who had fled begin to flee to him. And one of them, in fact, because Abu Jandal was in Mecca, and they had no fear of him fleeing to Medina now. So they loosened up watching him. In other words, he was mobile. He sneaks out because he gets wind. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu sends a message, and he gets wind that Abu Basir is out on the Red Sea, and there's nothing in the treaty that says that he can't go and join them. So he goes and he joins them, and now they're gathering momentum. So the Quraysh now it's a disaster. Because the Prophet ﷺ is not breaking his treaty, and he's got these Muslims that the Prophet's saying, I didn't tell him to do that, I don't have any control over them, and I can't help you. So the Quraysh say, then let them come back to Medina, we won't trouble them. Let them come back to Medina. So this is how the Fath came to Abu Jandal. It's very interesting. The Prophet said, be patient, Allah is going to give you. And this again is the importance of believing the bushra of Allah and His Messenger. When Allah and His Messenger give bushra, we have to believe it. If it's a good news, and He gave him good news, and there were Muslims there who weren't recognizing what was happening. But then it becomes clear to them. And that's why they said, Abshir, Ya Abu Basir, later. So he did, and he dies as shaheed, radiallahu anhum. And this is what. So it's a very interesting event. Now another thing that's important also is the prohibition of returning women. And this is important because obviously women are physically weaker than men, and also because of the prohibition of sexual relations between mushrikeen, whether they're of any religion other than Islam. If they're not Muslims, then they cannot marry the women. And so the women were prohibited from being returned. It's interesting also that in the treaty they only stipulated the rijal. And in the Arabic language you have that duality. It could be understood men, but it could also be understood that it was men and women. And the Prophet ﷺ said that we did not stipulate the women. In other words, you should have mentioned it if you did not want the women. So the Prophet ﷺ is not in any way stinting on his promises to the Meccans. And so they're quite clearly seeing now that it really was a great victory for them. And it's interesting because at that time the Quraysh actually believed it was a great victory for them. You see, the Quraysh thought, this is it, we've really got them now. This is what they believed. And the opposite is turning out to be true. Meanwhile, because there's a truce, there's peace between the Quraysh and the Muslims, there's more interchange. The Muslims are freer. In the Muslims that were in Mecca, like Abbas radiallahu anhu, and others, it's just loosened. The whole environment's a lot easier now. And so people are now beginning to convert as a result of this event. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also reminds them that Allah can make love after there was enmity between people. And this is really one of the proofs of the entire seerah of the Messenger of Allah, is that you can see his worst enemies that were not killed, they all end up becoming Muslims. And some of them, they were like Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, was a ferocious warrior against the Muslims. Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl swore that he would never enter into Islam. Amr ibn al-As was a sworn enemy of the Muslims, and what he tried to do with the Najashi and all these events. These people who really, even Abu Sufyan, who was so adamant about opposing the Prophet at every stage once he took the leadership of Quraysh, all of these people are going to become Muslims. And even Wahshi, who the Prophet ﷺ, obviously he could never look at him in the face. Prophet ﷺ couldn't look at him in his face, but he became Muslim. Hind, who ate the liver, a piece of the liver, and some of the ulama say, in fact, that's probably one of the main reasons why she became Muslim, because those cells got into her body from Hamza radiallahu anhu. Now, another thing, important thing that happens is a few months before Hudaybiyah from Al-Habasha, and remember that there were two groups in Habasha. One comes back, and with them is Uthman ibn Affan and others. But Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who becomes Ja'far al-Tayyar radiallahu anhu, Ja'far is there with his wife and many of the other believers who are there, and one of them is Ubaydullah ibn Jahsh, who is directly related to the Prophet ﷺ, cousin and brother-in-law from Zainab. He had been a Nasrani before Islam. When he made, and obviously this is somebody who had become Muslim and then went right to Abyssinia. So he had not spent much time with the Messenger of Allah, and he really hadn't. Islam hadn't taken root with him. He went to Abyssinia. He was very impressed with the Najashi, and he ends up going back to Christianity. And his wife Habiba, who's the daughter of Abi Sufyan, she doesn't follow him into Christianity. She remains a mu'mina. And in fact, when this happened, the Prophet ﷺ waited for the 4 months, and then he proposed to her from Medina, sent the proposal to Abyssinia, and it was actually the Najashi who became her wali, which is a proof that he was a Muslim also, because the Prophet gave him the wilayah. And you cannot take a mu'mina, cannot have a kafir who's a wali. So Najashi is actually the one who married her to the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and she, Habiba, will come back when Ja'far radiallahu anhu comes back to Medina. She comes back with that group. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam sends word that they can come. And so they are making preparations, and Najashi actually provides them the means to go back to Arabia. Now, another really important event that's happening is, if you remember at the Battle of the Khandaq, the Prophet ﷺ, there was that huge rock, and the Prophet was breaking it, and they saw 3 bolts of like lightning come out of it. And Salman asked the Prophet ﷺ, what does this mean? He said the first one, Allah gave him Sham, Yemen. That was the first one. The cities of Yemen were given to him. The second one, he was given Sham, Syria, and Palestine. And the third one, he was given Kisra's dominion, the Mulk of Khosrow, which is is Persia. And this, the sequence, is how it happens. In other words, the actual sequence that he explained to them in the Khandaq. He explained to them the first flash was Yemen, the second flash was Sham, and the third flash was Faris. And that is the historical sequence of how they came into Islam. So one of the things that he then does is he sends sallallahu alaihi wasallam a letter to the king, one of the kings of Yemen, the viceroy. He's actually a viceroy of the Persian, and he sends two emissaries to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, this is also the classic thing of a colonized people, because these were colonized people of the Persians. And the Arabs there were dressing like the Persians and shaving their beards and leaving their mustache to grow over the lip, which was a Farisi Persian, which is interesting because there's many Persians still do that. You know, if you see the older Persians now, because they've had since the revolution, I think a lot of it's changed. But if you see the older Persians, it was very common for them to have these mustaches that go way over their lips. And the Prophet ﷺ looked at it, and he was so disgusted by it, and he said, "Who told you to do this?" And he says, "This is what Kisra does." And so the Prophet ﷺ said, "My Lord told me to let the beard grow and to trim the mustache." So he was repelled by it. And then that night, while they're there, the Messenger of Allah is told by Jibreel that there was a coup in Persia, which we have historical evidence of this event happening. There was a coup in Persia, and the Shah's son actually kills him, and he takes over. And the Prophet ﷺ the next day tells the messengers that. He said, you know, the messages you're bringing about Persia might be irrelevant now because he was killed last night. Now, obviously, they're saying, how would he know? Because they know how long it takes to get to Persia. So they just go back kind of shaking their heads, and they tell the viceroy what he said to say. Now, it's going to take them a shorter time to get to Yemen than it will to get news from Persia that there's been a transition. And when what the Yemeni viceroy says, if he told us the truth, then he's definitely a prophet. And so when it comes, he bears witness and he enters into Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ also appointed him the ruler over his people. And this was a sign, one of the things that the Prophet promised the people, because this is a time now, really the governmental aspect of Islam is really firm now in Medina. And this is a time when the Prophet begins to send out messages to all the rulers of various places. Before that, he wasn't in a position to be taken seriously. Now he has a position that they're recognizing. And even Heraclius in Syria is concerned. Muqawqas, who was the Egyptian Coptic ruler, when the Prophet sends a letter to him, he actually says, I've been following him. In other words, they were concerned about it. Right? They were concerned. So the people knew about it. Each one of them will react differently. But in the letters, the Prophet ﷺ says, Aslam taslam. You know, Aslim taslam. Walaka mulkuka. You know, become Muslim and you will be safe from Allah and His Messenger and their armies, and you will also have your dominion. In other words, we didn't come to take your dominion away from you. Become Muslim, you can have your dominion. But if you reject it, then in the letter to the Copts, he said, you have the itham of the aqbat on you. In other words, the ruler is responsible for guiding his people. And because you're rejecting the guidance, you will not only have your wrong, but all of the people that you betrayed will be upon you. So that's the awesome responsibility of a ruler. Now, one of the things the Prophet ﷺ sent Hatib to Muqawqas, and he says to him, well, if he was a prophet,
Why didn't he make dua against his people in Mecca and Allah would have destroyed them? And immediately his messenger responded, you're a Christian, aren't you? He said, yes. And he said, you believe in Isa, don't you? He said, yes. He said, well, Isa was, they tried to kill him, and he was raised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and yet they weren't destroyed for all the terrible things until later. And he said, Anta Hakim, bu'ithta min qabri Hakim. You're a wise man and you were sent from a wise man. And so then he said, and this is the idea also, the Arabs say, Arsal labiban wa la tulsi. Send a sagacious man and don't tell him what to do. In other words, if you send somebody intelligent, you can't just give him some formulaic thing. If he says this, say this, because you never know what he's going to say. Send an intelligent man and then let him say what he's going to say, and it'll be intelligent. Right? So this is what the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. And then what he does, some very important things. He sends a robe. And Egypt was obviously a textile center at that time, and actually up to this day, Egyptian cotton and things like that. He sends a donkey, a baghla named Duldul, which is baghla was like a good thing. It was half donkey, half horse. And then he sends 2 women who he says, وَلَهُمَا مَقَامٌ عَظِيمٌ عِنْدَ الْقُبْطِ. These are 2 women who have very high status amongst us. In other words, he didn't send insignificant. This was a big thing that he did. And he sent Maria al-Qubtiyya and her cousin. And they, obviously, when they come, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Maria will actually, it's not her fault, but a lot of trouble arises out of this, which we'll go into because he does it a little later. And then the other thing, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sends a letter to Heracles, who's the Alim al-Rom, he's the Byzantine ruler in Syria. He sends a letter to him and tells him also to become Muslim. And Heracles says he wants to see some Qurayshis. And he tells his people to go out and see if there's any Qurayshis. Abu Sufyan and some of the Quraysh had been there in Syria with a caravan. So he calls them in, and they come in, and they're obviously nervous. This is the Alim al-Rom. This is a big, this would be, like a small country, very insignificant in terms of geopolitical status. A group of them happen to be doing business, and suddenly they get called, like a group of Haitian businessmen are here, and then they get called into the White House or something. They're nervous, and they come before him, and Abu Sufyan, he asks, which one of you is a relative of this man? And Abu Sufyan admits that he is a relative because he's from Bani Umayyah, and they're from the same great-grandfather. So he tells him, come forward. And then he tells the others to stay behind him. And then he asks him, is this man from your nobleman, or is he insignificant? He said, no, he's from the best of our families. And he said, did any one of his uncles or great-grandfathers or anybody in his family ever claim dominion amongst you to be a king or a prophet? He said, no, nobody. And then he said, who follows him? The nobles amongst you or the common people? He said, mostly poor people, slaves, insignificant people. And then he said, are you fighting him? And he said, oh yes, we're fighting. And he said, what's the war like? And he said, حَرْبُنَا بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَهُ سِجَالٌ. The war between us is attrition. It's one time we win, the next time he wins. And then he said, if it's true what you said, this man will possess the dominion under my feet soon enough. And then he said, let me explain to you. He said, the reason that I asked you to come forward is because if you lied, I wanted to see the other people to say he's lying. Right? So, because because he was their leader, they would be afraid to do that with him seeing it. And then he said, and I asked you about his nasab, because if he was a prophet, then he would have been somebody who has strong lineage amongst you. And then he said, and then I asked you about who follows him, if anybody claimed dominion, because he could simply be making a claim for his grandparents, which is very common. Like the son Shah, who's here in America, he still thinks he's the king of Persia, and he's got a court around him, and people, if somebody has been a king in the past, their offspring always think they're still royalty. And they always, really, it's a very interesting phenomenon about aristocracy, that they always hope to eventually get back what was rightfully theirs and what was wrongfully taken away from them. So it would have just been a claim that he was making or something like that, and since it wasn't, he said that obviously wasn't the case. And then he asked him about who follows him. And he said, poor people, and he said, well, that's who follows the messenger. And then he also said, what does he call you to? And the interesting thing about Abu Sufyan, this was obviously an opportunity for him to tell lies, but he actually didn't. He said, in fact, he gave very good da'wah, because he said, he calls us to worship one God, he calls us to leave our idols, he calls us to take care of the widow, the orphan, he calls us to establish our kinship bond. Everything he said was positive, right? And so he couldn't say he's telling us that we should all drink and fornicate and do this. He's telling them the good things. So he recognizes that what he's calling them to is a prophetic tradition. And then finally he said, the prophets are fought by their own people, and then the war is usually a war of attrition, except wearing down both sides. One wins, the other loses. But then in the end, al-aqibatu lil-muttaqin. They always win in the end. And then the other person who was Mundhir ibn Usawa, who was the king of Bahrain, the Prophet ﷺ also sent him a letter, and he actually becomes Muslim and tells the Messenger of Allah that he has Jews and he has Christians. What should he do with them? And the Messenger of Allah sends people there. And then Arab ibn al-Hadrami was the messenger that went to him. And then he also sent a letter to the Kisra. And when he got the letter, he ripped it up. He wouldn't even bother and just threw it. Because the Arabs, they called them akaratul aqarib, the scorpion and lizard eaters. The Persians looked at them like they were completely insignificant people. And so he just ripped it up, threw it out. And the Prophet ﷺ said, when he heard that, مَزَّقَ اللَّهُ مُلْكُهُ كَمَا مَزَّقَ رِسَالَةَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. May Allah tear up His dominion just like He tore up the letter of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, which eventually happens. Now, and then he also sent a letter to the king of Habasha, Najashi, and Najashi tells in private the Prophet's emissary, he says his people, if he announces this now, he doesn't have enough a'wan or ansar to do it. And so he said, I'm going to wait until I have enough people and then announce it to them. And he dies before that. And this, the ulama also take from this and other ayahs, like the ayah about the mu'min min ali Fir'aun yaktumu imanuhu. There was a believer from the people of Fir'aun hiding his iman. That it is permissible for a Muslim in a position of power and authority who can benefit the Muslims, it's permissible for him to hide his iman. In other words, if somebody, for instance, was in the Pentagon and he's a general or something, and he becomes a Muslim, and he sees that it's more beneficial for me to stay inside here and to work for the Muslims. I'm just using that as a modern example, but this is what happened. That's actually not only permissible, but it might be the best thing to do depending on the conditions, obviously. And so that's what Najashi chose to do. And he died before his hopes were realized. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ prayed upon him, and he is considered a Muslim. Rahimahullah. Radiyallahu anhu. So